Welcome to chapter 9 of traveling and listening to Jesus on his way to Jerusalem and the cross. The intensity of the travel we catch now as Jesus answers a question that has been since man began, I think. What happens to us when we die? And still a huge question for our culture and for every culture that has ever existed. Jesus gives us an example of two men. One goes to heaven and one does not. I believe all of the stories that Jesus told, he took out of actual human history, including this one. This particular story, we would love to make this metaphorical or allegorical because he deals with the subject of hell. No loving person wants to talk about people going to hell unless you're trying to save them from going to hell. Whoever walked this earth who knew more about hell than Jesus? No one. Who used the word hell more than any other character in the Bible? Jesus. If I was on the way to work today and I passed a neighbor's house and I saw that it was on fire, but my attitude was, hey, normally I know they sleep in and they're consenting adults. It's their problem. If they want to sleep in, yeah, their house is on fire, but they chose to sleep in. And we drive on. That's not being a good neighbor, is it? In fact, all of us, we would stop, try to check and see if we can get them out of that burning house. And that would be a loving act. And yet, when it comes to our own culture, our own families, our own friends, there is that part of us who find this whole subject of heaven and hell uncomfortable, distasteful, and it's all right to find hell distasteful. It is. And yet Jesus chose to talk about it more than anyone else because he came to save everyone. He offers forgiveness of sin and a way to heaven to everyone. Unfortunately, as the great evangelist during the Great Awakening, Charles Finney, said, we live out what he called moral insanity. Moral insanity is when you run away from heaven as if it was hell, and you run towards hell as if it was heaven. He says that's moral insanity. Hard to argue with that. His apprenticeship was as a lawyer, and his philosophy of preaching was to leave your feet firmly planted in midair with no proof, no evidence other than we need to accept Christ. And here Jesus tells this story of two men. The first one doesn't take long. It's the beggar, and he gives his name, Lazarus. Begging in that day was not a dishonorable part of life. Everyone had, according to Jewish tradition and law, had to give to those who were homeless and beggars. And so he really provided a service. And so it wasn't a dishonorable thing. But he was crippled and ill, had sores all over his body, and he had friends or family who left him begging outside of a rich man's house. And he begged for the scraps that fell from the rich man's table. Now, here's something you probably didn't know. In that day, they would take bread and lay it on their chest as a bib so that it wouldn't get on their clothing while they ate. Today, one of the things we had to do was I dropped breakfast on my shirt, and we had to clean my shirt before we started this. If I had bread there to catch it, then they would just throw that bread out as garbage. And he would beg for that bread. And apparently he didn't receive that very often, or not at all. And it says the beggar dies, goes to heaven. And we describe that in this chapter. And then you have the other guy who it says died and was buried. Notice the beggar wasn't necessarily buried. He probably ended up on the garbage heap, which was of that culture for a homeless person like him. The rich man, though, it says, died and was buried, and lifted up his eyes in hell, in torment. And by special provision from God, he has a vision and he sees the beggar, Lazarus, and Abraham. Everybody knew where Abraham was. Everybody knew he was in heaven. And the rich man speaks to Abraham and says, hey, send the beggar, send Lazarus to dip his finger in water and cool my tongue. I am tormented in this flame. Of course, scholars have argued whether or not hell is an actual place of fire and brimstone. You read the story. You come to your own conclusion here. From biblical evidence, come to your own conclusion. To me, one of the worst things about hell that's described here is when the rich man realizes he has no way of getting around his situation. He remembers his family. He remembers and still cares about. He says, I have 5 brothers. They're at Dad's house. Send Lazarus to my father's house. He may warn them so that they do not come to this awful place of torment. And Abraham says, hey, and he puts a time frame here. He says they have Moses and the prophets, that they won't listen to them. They won't listen to even someone raised from the dead. Well, what's interesting is the one telling this story died and was raised from the dead, and he's right. Abraham was right. We still don't listen to the one raised from the dead. The intensity of this story as we get close to the cross. This is why Jesus went to the cross, so that no one, remember, would perish, but that all would have eternal life. We need to allow this story to motivate us to reach every possible person, that no one would perish, but that all would have eternal life.